If you appreciate my videos, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. If you want to help me keep on teaching, writing, and making videos, then please think about becoming a patron. So my name's Chris Hughes, for anybody that doesn't know, and I've been writing and teaching and making videos about Celtic mythology and stuff like that for quite a few years now. And it's really important to me to see people who are interested in these things and interested in Celtic paganism to have access to sources that they can trust, sources that will give them accurate information. So that's really kind of what I'm all about. And I'm partly doing these Facebook Lives to promote my new class that I'm teaching, which is called Celtic Beginnings. And that starts on June 26th. And you can see a link to find out more about that in the comments, and also to my YouTube channel in the description there. And if you want to go back and watch some of the earlier videos in this series, which I refer to, they're on my Facebook page, but they're nicely edited and you might enjoy them more on the YouTube channel. So the link to that is there. So today's question is about Celtic gods and goddesses, and that's just about my favorite thing in the world to talk about. And I do have some notes because that way I don't say quite so much, and quite so much. I can flow a bit better. The question I received went like this: explain why a Celtic pantheon doesn't really exist. So you probably all know a pantheon is a group of gods from one culture, like the Greek gods are the Greek pantheon and the Norse gods are the Norse pantheon, that sort of thing. Pantheon is way too blunt an instrument for a set of gods like Celtic or Hindu gods, because there's just way too many. Now, maybe I should know more about Greek mythology than I do, but I don't think that there's like hundreds, if not thousands, of Greek gods. Hinduism especially has just innumerable deities, and the Celts aren't far behind. So that makes it very difficult to talk about a pantheon. I don't think that's what the question is really getting at, but I'm just going to try and cover it all, because it's an interesting question with a lot of misunderstandings attached to it. A lot of Celtic deities are very, very specialized, like Credna, the Irish deity who's the god of people who do brass work with soft metals. Now that's pretty specialized. A lot of them are very localized. And many of them are just names to us, and we don't really have any information about who they are, what they are. Whereas pantheon is a Greek word, and it fits the Greek and Greco-Roman scenario pretty well. So in school, you probably learned about Greek mythology a little bit. Maybe not very much, but a little bit. It usually goes something like this. Each god has quite a specific function. Like Poseidon is the god of the sea, and Apollo is the sun god, and so on. Quite often, the way it's taught, we're taught that the Greeks and the Roman pantheon, which is quite similar, that you can draw almost a direct line from Poseidon, god of the sea, to the Roman Neptune, also god of the sea, and so on. There's these direct correspondences between one pantheon and another. And that works very well with the Greeks and Romans, because Roman religion is based on Greek religion, essentially. But it doesn't work well when we're talking about the Celtic deities. So Celtic deities might be really vague, as I've said, or they might have like a whole bunch of functions. I mean, just off the top of my head, we have the goddess Brige in the Irish deities, who's the goddess of poetry, the goddess of smithcraft, and the goddess of healing. But lots of other stuff too. We've got Lu, who's many-skilled. His whole thing is being able to do everything. But we also have deities whose functions are not at all clear. Now, people sometimes try to draw these kind of correspondences like we have in the Greeks and Romans, also between one Celtic culture and another. So they go looking for the Welsh version of the Irish Dagda, for example. You're not going to find him. I don't think you don't think there's such a thing. Or they go looking for the Irish counterpart of the Gaulish deity Belinos. And I don't think you're going to find that either. You really need to sit down and get to know each deity almost like getting to know a person. And then you'll find a lot of depth, and you'll find these really subtle connections that I love. And there's a few ways you can sit down and get to know a deity. You can read their mythology if they have mythology, because a lot of Celtic mythology is gone. It disappeared primarily due to the Romans. So some deities do have very rich mythology, and I urge you to go and find the original sources and read those. And that's something I'll be covering in that class I'm teaching, is how to find those, because you can actually find most of them online. They won't necessarily be the most up-to-date translations, but you can find the original myths translated into English rather than something in a simplified book or somebody's blog or something like that where they're just kind of retelling the story. There's a place for retelling stories, but if you're trying to get at the myth, go for the myth itself, I would advise. If there's no myth, you can study what we know from history and archaeology, like are there inscriptions to that deity? Are they in a particular area geographically? Do we know what people associated them with in the past, and so on. And finally, of course, you can just try to develop a relationship. So there isn't a pantheon here at all. It's very nuanced and it's very messy. And modern polytheists are just people who honor or worship or believe in many gods. Polytheist means many gods. Okay, they try to divide Celtic deities and cultures up by history and by geography. And that mostly makes sense, but it can sometimes be kind of artificial and arbitrary to draw lines between different Celtic cultures. But here's the basic pattern that people generally use. So there are the Gaulish deities. These are the deities who come from that part of the European continent where the early Celts were. We only know these deities from inscriptions because all the mythology of Gaul is lost to us. It's just gone. But the inscriptions, they tell us something. You can see whether a deity perhaps was popular or not, or what area it was popular in, what kind of people were leaving inscriptions to the deity, and so on. But all this stuff is Roman influenced. And the biggest problem is that we don't quite understand, how welcome was that influence? Whether it was reciprocal, whether the Romans and the Celts were making friends. Sometimes they did, but in general they were at war a great deal too. And the Romans were doing their best to colonize and oppress the Celts. So we have to keep that in mind with the inscriptions, that we're seeing Celtic deities through Roman eyes, or we're seeing them through Romanized eyes of Celts who are getting Romanized over the generations and centuries. So some of the well-known Gaulish deities would be Rosmerta, Belinos, who I mentioned earlier, Epona, the horse goddess, and Lugos. There's loads of others, though. I've just named four, give you an idea, but there are just loads and loads of Gaulish deities. So the next category might be the Irish deities. Ireland, at least, it's a discrete island. It's really easy to identify whether something's Irish or not. Irish deities are mostly known from medieval texts and sometimes from folklore, the Irish folklore. So there may be folk customs about a deity or stories about that deity that aren't in the medieval texts, but they've been recorded probably in the last couple of centuries because people were still telling them or doing these things. During the early years of neo-paganism, like from the mid-20th century onward, and to some extent this is still the case today, what people think of when they hear the word Celtic deities is they hear Irish deities. So people tend, the further they are away from Britain and Ireland, the more likely they are to conflate the word Irish and the word Celtic as being the same thing. but it's not. Irish is a Celtic culture, but Celtic is an umbrella in the sense of there being several Celtic cultures under that umbrella. So some of the Irish deities you'll have heard of will be Brigid, the Morrigan, Manannán Maclear, Lugh, and so on. The situation is similar in Wales. The Welsh deities and Welsh culture, again, we know mostly from medieval texts and a little bit from folklore. But this language group and culture used to be spread all over Britain, and I talked about that in the last Facebook Live, which is, the video is now called Irish Deities, Welsh Deities. So the whole of the island of Britain, Scotland, Wales, and England, all used to speak a Celtic language, which we'll just call Brythonic. It was undoubtedly a group of dialects which made up this language, but again, it's pretty much lost, except for what turned into modern Welsh, which we still, of course, have that language, and loads of people speak Welsh. This language group and culture was everywhere. And so as a result of this, a lot of modern people and pagans refer to what they know of from the medieval texts and Welsh folklore as Brythonic or Brittonic rather than Welsh, because Welsh is not maybe the perfect descriptor. So I'm talking about goddesses like Ceridwen and Rhiannon, and gods like Mabon ap Modron and Lle. But there's another layer in Britain, because we have inscriptions from the Roman era as well, just like in Gaul. So a few of the deities in these inscriptions, in the Roman era inscriptions in Britain, are the same as the deities we find in the medieval texts, which is nice. It gives us a little bit of continuity. Two obvious ones are Nodens. So Nodens there's the ruins of a big Roman temple to Nodens in Gloucestershire in southern England. And there is a deity or a character in Welsh literature called Gwyn ap Nudd. Nudd, his father, is cognate with Nodens. So Nodens and Nudd are the same deity. The same is true for Maponos, who was particularly worshipped along the Hadrian's Wall area in Britain, which is kind of straddles the Scottish-English border. And he's known as Mabon ap Modron in Welsh literature. But there are a lot of deities from Roman period inscriptions in Britain which don't have counterparts in medieval texts. So we used to call these Romano-British deities, and people do still sometimes, but now people often call these deities also Brythonic or Brittonic is much more fashionable now. And some polytheists, now hang on, this gets a little complex here. Some polytheists prefer to call just the deities we know from early inscriptions the Brythonic deities. They're kind of shying away from the deities we know from Welsh literature and calling them, oh, they're literary characters. I happen to disagree with that. I think that's a false dichotomy, but everybody has a right to their own way of doing things and their own belief. On top of all this, we also have localized deities all over Britain and Ireland. So things like river goddesses, like Boann of the Boyne River in Northern Ireland, Sabrina of the Severn in southern England, and like loads of others. Probably most rivers were connected with a goddess all over Europe at one time. And many of those names we can guess at from the names of the rivers as they're known today, but not always. Names change. There are also deities associated with springs or wells, like there are several wells associated with Brigid in Ireland, with Modron, the goddess Modron in Cornwall, and so on. And there are deities associated with certain hills and mountains. And in Ireland in particular, there are some deities which have a strong association with a certain family, or sept, I think you call it, which controlled certain areas. So I hope you can see that things are not very cut and dried. We just have all these deities which we know from a big mix of sources, all sort of running around together, doing their thing. Or not, depending on your view. Perhaps they're all in corners avoiding each other because you're not from my era or you're not from my geographical area. That's a theological question that I can't answer. My opinion is that they're not doing that. If your opinion is that they are, you have a right to that opinion. So I haven't mentioned Scotland very much. So Scotland's kind of my specialist subject because I lived there for a long time. So as I mentioned, and this is hard for people to get their head around sometimes, both England and Scotland used to speak a language related not to Irish, not to Saxon, but to Welsh. So the whole place was Brythonic speaking, and that includes the Picts up in Scotland. We don't know much about the Pictish language. They hadn't really used writing by the time they were subsumed by the next culture who came along, the Scots. But we have, a few people's names and a few place names and things like that, enough that we can be pretty confident it was a Brythonic language. Maybe not that different than neighboring Brythonic dialects. That's hard to say. So as some of you probably know, during the Roman occupation of Britain, a guy called Hadrian thought it would be a great idea to build a big wall. And this wall roughly follows the line of what is today the English-Scottish border. Not exactly. It cuts modern Scotland off from modern England, more or less. And it's hard to say whether the Picts were really very different than the people south of Hadrian's Wall, or whether the very fact of the wall caused a cultural split, that the language would have developed in its own direction north of the wall and south of the wall. Culture would have developed in its own direction north and south of the wall, although they were probably similar beforehand. It's very difficult to be sure about that. The Romans said some things about, the Picts are so fierce, it's easier just to put up a wall. They had their hands pretty full with the British natives in general, and maybe they just thought going that far north was not a fight they were ready for. And saying that the people north of the wall area were so savage that it was just too scary might have just been a great excuse. The Picts might not have been all that different, but we don't know. But they certainly appear to have developed differently. But we don't know anything about their religion. We just don't. We don't have names of Pictish deities or anything like that. So we don't know what Pictish culture looked like. And then by the 6th century, a group of people called the Scots began to settle in southwest Scotland. Now, Scotland is called that because of these people. And these people came from Ireland. So the Scots came from Ireland with a Gallic or Gaelic speaking culture or Irish speaking culture. But by that time they were pretty well Christianized, and so was everybody in Britain by that time, in Britain and Ireland. So the roots of their pre-Christian Irish religion don't go as deep in Scotland. Yes, they brought some stories with them. Yes, they brought a lot of folklore and customs with them and their language, and it absolutely changed the culture of what we now call Scotland. When the Scots arrived, and slowly their language and to some extent their customs spread throughout Scotland. Their deities, I'm sure, came with them in some form. It's not recorded very well, of course, because people were writing about Christian things then, not about pagan things. And Scotland doesn't have this medieval literature tradition for mythological literature that Ireland and Wales have. So the original Brythonic culture found in Scotland, what we call Scotland today, has Gaulish and Romano-British pre-Christian religion overlaid upon it. And then some Irish Gaelic-speaking culture and religion overlaid upon that. when I'm standing in Scotland, when I'm standing in the area that means something to me, especially, I can feel the imprint of all this when I stand on the land. One layer rising to the top here, and another layer rising to the top there, and a sense of a particular deity in another place. So Scotland is more of a crossroads than anything. But that's pretty natural in Britain and Ireland anyway. That feeling of different layers of cultural history on the land, being part of the land. You know, we have the Neolithic monuments all around us. People outside of Britain and Ireland often don't realize that, you know, there's not quite a standing stone in every field, but you don't have to go far to find one. You don't have to go far to find some kind of burial mound or old fort. We just live among that stuff. And so our Celtic ancestors had legends and things about these places. These weren't built by the Celts. These were built by people before the Celts, the Neolithic people. But the Celtic people had a whole folklore and a series of beliefs that grew up around these Neolithic monuments. They didn't know what they meant either, but they fitted them into their worldview. And so it's natural, I think, for us in Britain and Ireland to fit new things into our worldview and feel that they're sort of part of the land. So just to recap, there really is no such thing as a Celtic pantheon. You can pick a cultural group based on a place or a historical period and call them a pantheon if you want to. That's up to you. But no group is really entirely separate from the others. They're a bit intertwined, at least around the edges. They bleed into one another a bit. And Celtic culture and religion is quite resistant to things like systems and categories and borders. And that's where a lot of its richness and beauty lies, if you ask me. But if you like to be able to put things in little boxes, you may be frustrated. Every region and historical period is unique, but they're just connected to one another. By the same token, lumping everything together as some generic Celtic thing, that Celtic just means anything that's old and cool and kind of from the British Isles, that doesn't work either. You need to have a sense of place and a sense of the cultures within cultures. And I think the further away you are sort of geographically from the center of that, the further you are away from Britain and Ireland, like North America or Australia, the harder it is to see the details naturally, just like a British person doesn't see the details of what's going on in South America or something like that. We tend to lump it all together and make a lot of generalizations. But there's a lot of cultural nuance and historical baggage that if you're serious about Celtic paganism, you need to be willing and open to learning about this stuff. And not just saying, I'm going to do Celtic paganism, but I'm not interested in really going very deep with it. The further away you are from the center, the greater your need to get some depth in your knowledge. That you get something out of your Celtic religion, and also so as not to offend and possibly even appropriate other people's stuff. Do you really want to do that? That's up to you, I guess, too.